In the underworld, power didn't wear a crown. It moved in whispers, in nods, in the glance of a man you didn't see until it was too late. From smoke-filled backrooms to the silent reach of the docks and boardrooms, they shaped a city without leaving fingerprints. Lucky Luciano, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, three men who turned crime into an empire, rewrote its rules and vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a silence that still holds the streets in its grip. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. The cobblestones of Via Toledo glistened with last night's rain. Early morning light clung to the rooftops of Naples like fogged glass, warm but unsentimental. Church bells tolled somewhere beyond the alley, their rhythm fractured by the murmur of footsteps echoing down narrow, cluttered lanes. A man walked alone. His steps were slow, not with age, but with a caution born of injury. His right shoulder slouched, the linen of his tan suit wrinkled at the elbow from a fall he hadn't quite recovered from. One eye was swollen shut, the other remained open, glassy and watchful, scanning each movement from behind gold-rimmed spectacles. It was January 1946. His name was Salvatore Lucania, but no one called him that. Not anymore. To the Americans, he had once been Lucky Luciano, architect of the five families, silent director of violence, chairman of an empire built on heroin, corruption, and the illusion of order. But here, in Naples, he was just another exile, another relic in a city built from ashes and regrets. And on this day, no one recognized him. Not even the young man who had struck him 5 minutes earlier, with the butt of a pistol and a curse spat in Neapolitan dialect. Luciano hadn't fought back. He didn't scream. He didn't even cover his head. He simply stood there as the boy, 17, maybe 18, rifled through his wallet, kicked him once in the ribs for insult, and disappeared into the crowd. Now the great man limped away with a face like cracked marble and a silence that stretched wider than any alley. He turned the corner, tucked his bloodied handkerchief into his breast pocket, and vanished into the shadow of an open-air cafe. A waiter glanced up, saw the limp, the bruises, the loose tie hanging like a noose from his collar, and looked away. No one helped him, because no one knew who he was anymore. That was the thing about ghosts. They only mattered to the people who remembered. But memory fades, and power. Even faster. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, one hand bracing against the chipped edge of a marble table. For a moment, his breath caught. Not from pain, but from memory. The smoke curled like ink in water, and with it came the past. It hadn't always been like this. 10 years ago, he had sat in a silk chair on the 27th floor of the Waldorf Astoria, his feet resting on a Persian rug bought from a Persian prince. There had been Cuban cigars in the drawer, a decanter of Glenlivet, and a direct line to every borough, every racket, every judge he needed. He had made the city move. Now the city had forgotten him. He took another drag, slower this time, as if each puff could pull him back to something he used to be. But even the cigarette tasted different here. More bitter, more foreign, like smoke from someone else's fire. Across the street, school children spilled out of a courtyard gate, their laughter piercing the stillness. Luciano watched them. He watched the boys shove each other, backpacks swinging, their futures still blank pages. He remembered being that boy once. Not in Naples, but in Leccara Friddi, a dusty hillside town in Sicily, where goats outnumbered books and every man had the same fear in his bones. He remembered what his father said when they left for America. You'll be lucky if you survive New York. That was the joke, wasn't it? He had survived. More than that. He had conquered. And now he was just a name that whispered through the underworld like a fading song. He stubbed out the cigarette and stood again. The world spun for a second. Vertigo, or blood loss, or maybe just the weight of memory. He held onto the edge of the table and steadied himself, then began walking with that same broken rhythm. The limp, the shuffle, the shoulder rolled tight like he was still bracing for another punch. As he moved through the street, old buildings watched him like mourners. Windows with cracked shutters, flower pots on rusted balconies, faded laundry flapping like surrender flags. Every corner reminded him of something. A place, a name, a moment that once burned bright, now dull with time. There was the butcher's shop that used to be a cafe, The fountain where he once kissed a girl before leaving for the docks. The alley where he first stabbed a man over a pair of boots. All ghosts now. He reached the edge of the piazza and paused. The sky had turned a dull pewter. Pigeons flapped overhead, circling the statues like soldiers returning from war. Luciano leaned against a stone wall and closed his eyes. It wasn't just exile. It was erasure. They had taken everything. His country, his name, even his myth. When they put him on that Navy ship in 1946, they didn't just deport him. They amputated him from the world he'd built. His fingerprints were still on New York, but no one dared mention his name. His face was absent from newspapers. His enemies cheered. His friends vanished. Even Meyer Lansky sent only brief, coded letters. A man in Florida who now lived under his own shadow. The commission kept going without him. The families made money. The rackets evolved. But Luciano, he had become a cautionary tale, a lesson whispered in back rooms. Don't get too famous. Look what happened to Lucky. He opened his eyes and saw a reflection in a window. His own. A hunched figure, sunken cheeks, eyes that looked too large for the face around them. He barely recognized himself. This wasn't the man who'd walked through the Lexington Hotel surrounded by bodyguards, or who dined with judges and senators under false names. This wasn't the man who had turned crime into commerce. This was someone else, a remnant. And yet, beneath it all, a fire still smoldered. He wasn't done. Not yet. Back in his small rented apartment above the train tracks, Luciano sat on the edge of his bed that night and removed his shoes like a soldier laying down armor. He winced at the bruise on his hip, then poured a glass of water and turned on the radio. American jazz filtered in through static. He closed his eyes and let the music take him. To Harlem, to Broadway, to the back rooms of the Cotton Club, where deals were made over laughter and gin, where gangsters dressed better than bankers, and the night never truly ended. He missed it. Not the money, not even the power, the feeling, the pulse of the city when it belonged to him. He missed being remembered. The next morning, he wrote a letter, not to a friend, but to a contact in Havana, a man named Santoro, who owed him 3 favors and had forgotten 2 of them. Luciano's script was jagged but deliberate. He wrote of shipments, of opportunity, of rebuilding something smaller, but cleaner. No headlines, no noise. He would begin again, not in the spotlight, but in the margins. The stage might be gone, but the actor still remembered his lines. And sometimes, the ghost knew better how to haunt than to rule. He folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it beside the ashtray. Outside, the same boy who had robbed him the day before passed beneath the window. Luciano didn't call out. He didn't move. He just watched. Not with hatred, not with fear, but with understanding. He had been that boy once, hungry, reckless, invisible. Now he was something else, something in between myth and man, something not quite gone. Lucky Luciano, the king who built a kingdom out of shadows, was still standing, still watching, still waiting for the story to begin again. The steamships came in waves, ferrying the poor, the hungry, and the desperate across an ocean that promised more than it could ever give. At Ellis Island, they stood in long lines under the hum of flickering lamps, names butchered by clerks who never looked up, the echo of dozens of dialects smothered by the call of American English. Among them, in 1906, was a boy of 9, gaunt, silent, eyes too old for his face. His name was Salvatore Lucania. He carried no suitcase, only a bundle of rags, a bronze crucifix on twine, and a quiet resentment that would never quite leave him. Born in Locara Fridi, a sun-bleached Sicilian town, whose hills whispered of old vendettas and dried blood, he had known hunger like a second sibling. His father, Antonio, had saved for years to bring the family to America. The promise was work, dignity, a future. Instead, they got Hell's Kitchen. The tenement on West 15th Street was a box stacked on boxes. 5 stories of coughing, cooking, screaming, and silence. All pressed between brick walls that sweated in the summer and cracked in the winter. The Lucania apartment had 1 window, 2 cots, and 3 generations crammed into a space meant for half that. At night, Salvatore lay on the floorboards listening to rats scrabble behind the walls. His mother, Rosalia, prayed to a Madonna fixed above the stove. His father rose at 4 a.m. to haul garbage in Manhattan streets. coming home reeking of rot and sweat, too tired to speak, too proud to complain. In school, Salvatore sat in the back row, understanding nothing. The teachers mocked his accent. The other boys laughed at his shoes, held together with string and hope. He learned to speak English from alley fights and overheard insults. Not from books. He learned fast. He learned who to hit, when to run, and how to lie with his face still. By 12, he had joined the Five Pointers. Not officially, not yet, but he ran errands for the older boys, watched doorways, passed messages. He learned to keep secrets like currency, learned that fists could replace hunger, and loyalty was just another word for survival. And he learned about power, not the kind men held in City Hall or bank vaults, but the kind that traveled in whispers, power that moved through the streets like heat, invisible but undeniable. It lived in the men who never looked over their shoulder, who tipped cops instead of fearing them, who wore suits on Sundays and didn't carry change. The men who didn't ask. They told Salvatore wanted to be one of them. He was 13 the first time he got picked up by police, caught trying to extort a fruit vendor on 10th Avenue with two older kids who ditched him when the siren echoed off the walls. The beat cop cuffed him hard and spat in his face. At the precinct, they didn't bother booking him. Too small, too stupid, too Italian. They let him go with a warning. That night, he sat in an alley behind their building, lips split and pride shattered, tracing his fingers over the scab on his cheek, and he made a quiet vow. Next time, they wouldn't let him go. Next time, they'd respect him. The Lower East Side was a mosaic of immigrants, Jews, Italians, Irish, Germans. Each street a different tongue, a different code. Turf lines were invisible but fatal. You didn't cross them unless you knew someone or had something to prove. It was here that Salvatore met Maya Lansky. The story was not dramatic. No street fight, no shared enemy. Just two boys at the same dice game behind the kosher butcher's stall. Maya rolled with quiet precision. Salvatore watched with suspicion. When another boy accused Maya of cheating and tried to steal the pot, Salvatore stepped in. Not out of friendship, but instinct. A stone in his palm, a shout and blood on the pavement. The boy fled. Maya never said thank you. But the next day, he brought Salvatore a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and said, "You're not that dumb for a Goomba." Salvatore laughed. "And you're not that cheap for a kike." They were 13. They would become kings. Maya Lansky was not like the other Jewish boys. He was calm, clinical, brilliant. Even then, he could do sums in his head, calculate odds and seconds, and spoke of things like leverage, control, and principles. Salvatore, who by now insisted on being called Charlie, had fists and instincts. Maya had plans and patience. Together, they were dangerous. They started small, running protection on pushcart vendors, organizing craps games in alleyways, charging for insurance with the polite threat of fire. But it was never sloppy, never loud. Maya taught Charlie to think beyond fists, to build rackets, not rackets. "You break a window, you get 10 cents, Maya said once. But if you threaten to break a window, you get $10 and the window stays whole." Charlie listened and learned. By 16, Charlie was dressing sharper than boys twice his age. Pinstripe suits bought second-hand and tailored by a drunk tailor who owed him $5. His shoes were always shined, his hair slicked back with a pocket comb he kept like a talisman. He was building something. Not a gang, not yet. An identity. Lucania became Luciano. The hard O on the end gave it weight, sharpness. Americans could pronounce it. It sounded like someone important, someone clean, someone above the street. But the streets never let go that easy. There was violence, always. Blood in stairwells, switchblades in dark alleys, boot heels against ribs. He saw a friend shot through the throat over a girl, another arrested and never seen again. The world was not kind, and Charlie hardened accordingly. What others feared, he used. He wasn't afraid of jail. He'd already done time in a juvenile workhouse for heroin possession. He wasn't afraid of death. He'd seen it in too many eyes to flinch. What he feared was being small, forgettable, trapped like his father, knee-deep in trash until the lungs gave out. In 1920, Prohibition hit the streets like fire on dry brush. It was the greatest opportunity Charlie had ever seen. With Lansky's help, and connections through fellow Italian and Jewish crews, he began moving liquor, real Canadian whiskey, not bathtub gin. Speakeasies were sprouting like weeds. Politicians wanted their cut. Cops wanted envelopes. Everyone had a price. Charlie started paying, but only when he had to, and never twice. The partnership with Lansky evolved. They pooled contacts, laid out routes, reinvented corruption as strategy. By 20, Lucky Luciano was making more in a week than his father made in a year. He didn't look back. He moved out of the tenement, bought silk shirts, took taxis instead of trolleys. He drank bourbon, smoked Lucky Strikes, and listened to jazz not because he liked it, but because the right people liked it. Image mattered. He was creating a myth. Lucky, the American gangster, the new breed. Not a thug, a businessman, a boss in waiting. Still, not all memories faded clean. One afternoon, years later, Charlie visited his father in the old neighborhood. Antonio Lucania still lived in the same apartment, still swept the streets in front of his stoop, still clung to an idea of respectability that Charlie had long since buried. "You wear a nice suit," Antonio muttered, not meeting his eyes. "But does that make you a man?" Charlie didn't answer. He handed him a thick envelope. Antonio refused it. Charlie left it on the counter and walked out, not looking back. That night, he drank alone and thought about the cracked window in the tenement kitchen, the one that had never been fixed. Some things you never outrun. What defined Lucky Luciano wasn't just the money, or the blood, or the empire he was building. It was the eyes, cold, calculated, tired beyond his years. He had learned too much, too young. The people were tools. The violence was currency. The power, once tasted, never left your tongue. He was no longer the boy who stepped off the boat in 1906. That boy was gone. In his place stood someone else. Something else. A man born of fire and fists and silence. A creature of alley shadows and steel resolve. A king still in the making. But a king nonetheless. Lucky Luciano would not be erased. Not by poverty, not by America, not by time. New York, 1931. The city was caught between two worlds. One of crumbling tradition and one of calculated ambition. Above ground, skyscrapers clawed upward like promises of a new America. But below, in the smoke-filled corners of Little Italy and the neon veins of Manhattan nightlife, a blood war had been quietly building. Slow, steady, methodical. At the center of it all stood Charles Lucky Luciano. And he was done waiting. The war between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano had become a cancer. Each man claimed to be capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and each ruled like a relic. Masseria with his bloated paranoia and clumsy violence. Maranzano with his Roman obsession and rigid Sicilian codes. Both were men out of time. Lucky saw it with a gambler's clarity. The old ways were dead, the feudal nonsense of omerta, of blood oaths and endless vendettas. It didn't belong in America anymore. What they needed was structure, modernity, a machine, not a monarchy. And to build that machine, he would have to kill the men who refused to let go. It began with Joe, the boss, Masseria. By 1930, Luciano had become Masseria's trusted lieutenant. He smiled at Joe's jokes, lit his cigars, and kept his books clean. He sat at the table while Masseria shuffled alliances like playing cards, growing more paranoid by the week. But behind that smile, Lucky was playing a longer game. He met in secret with Maranzano, offering to flip sides. Maranzano agreed, promising control of Manhattan and full autonomy in exchange for Masseria's head. On April 15, 1931, Luciano arranged a lunch with Masseria at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a small seaside restaurant in Coney Island. They ate linguine and drank wine under a striped awning, while the Atlantic groaned just beyond the dunes. At some point during the meal, Luciano excused himself to the restroom, and that was the signal. In came Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese. Luciano's most trusted allies. Masseria never stood a chance. By the time Luciano returned, the table was splattered in red, and the boss slumped backward, bullets in his head and blood dripping down the white linen tablecloth like spilled Chianti. The king was dead. Long live the future. But the future, it turned out, still had a past. Maranzano took Masseria's place, proclaiming himself the supreme leader of all mafia operations in America. He reorganized the gangs into families, assigning territories, creating ranks. Boss, underboss, consigliere. He even drew parallels to Julius Caesar, calling himself Il Duce. and distributing photos of Roman statues at sit-downs. Luciano watched, quietly amused. He knew this couldn't last. Maranzano's ego was a fatal flaw, but his biggest mistake wasn't vanity. It was mistrust. Within weeks, he had labeled Luciano, Siegel, and Lansky as unreliable, and ordered their deaths, Luciano found out, and decided it would be Maranzano who died instead. The plan was simple, brutal in its efficiency. On September 10, 1931, Luciano sent 4 Jewish hitmen, handpicked by Lansky, to Maranzano's office on the 9th floor of the New York Central Building. They posed as government agents, complete with fake badges, fedoras, and silence. Maranzano stood behind his desk, surrounded by ledgers and framed saints. When the men burst in, he didn't make it to his gun. They stabbed him first, 5 times in the chest, then shot him to make sure. The scene was over in less than 2 minutes. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a quiet end to an old-world empire. That afternoon, Luciano walked the streets of Manhattan like a man shedding old skin. There were no tears, no speeches, no vengeance required. With both Masseria and Maranzano gone, there was no boss of all bosses anymore. Because Luciano refused the title, he knew too well what came with the crown. Instead, he proposed something no one had dared imagine. Shared power. He called it the Commission. The Commission was not a gang. It was a boardroom. A syndicate of syndicates. 6 families, 5 in New York, 1 in Chicago, would meet to resolve disputes, enforce discipline, and approve hits. No family could act unilaterally. No war could erupt without consensus. It was democracy with brass knuckles. And it worked. Luciano installed bosses who answered to logic, not lineage. He chose men who understood business, not just blood. Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, Vincent Mangano, Frank Costello, Al Capone in Chicago. He was never the figurehead, but everyone knew who built the engine and who held the key. The newspapers never printed the truth. To them, Maranzano was just another bootlegger slain in office, and Luciano was barely mentioned. But in the underworld, the message was clear. The old ways were dead, gone were the Sicilian codes and the rigid caste systems. In their place rose a corporate empire. Narcotics, gambling, extortion, labor rackets. All organized like a business portfolio. Territories were managed, profits split, meetings held. Luciano had turned the mafia into a multinational, and he did it with blood still on his shoes. Still, nothing in this world is clean. In quiet moments, Luciano would replay the killings in his head, the twitch in Messeria's fingers as he bled out in the sun, the look on Maranzano's face when the blades sank into his chest. He didn't regret them, but he remembered, because that was the cost. To become a king in this world, you had to betray the ones who crowned you. By winter, Luciano had moved into a new penthouse overlooking the Hudson. It wasn't showy, just clean lines, white walls, polished floors. From there, he could see the piers where shipments were unloaded, the clubs where money changed hands, the precincts where cops took envelopes. He ran it all, not through fear, but through structure. He rarely shouted, rarely threatened. He didn't need to. His name was enough. One call from Lucky Luciano, and things got handled, quietly, cleanly, permanently. At night, he still drank bourbon with Lansky. They'd sit in low booths at the back of smoke-drenched lounges, jazz humming through the air like a second heartbeat. What we built, Luciano once said, swirling the glass. It'll outlast us both. Lansky just nodded. He never believed in permanence, but Luciano did, because for the first time in his life, he had created something that didn't rely on chaos, something that couldn't be erased by one bullet or one boss's bad temper, an order in the disorder, and at the center of it, a man who had never stopped gambling. Only now, the stakes were measured in cities, not coins. Still, beneath the empire and the calm exterior, there was a crack, the knowledge that he had killed his way to peace, the understanding that every handshake in this new system was bound with blood. But he accepted it, because Luciano had always believed something few men were willing to say aloud. You don't clean the streets without breaking bone. In the end, the Maranzano War wasn't about power. It was about vision. 2 men had tried to keep crime tethered to the past, and 1 man had dragged it, bleeding, into the future, the morning he stepped into the Waldorf Astoria. For the first time as a resident, Luciano wore a dove-grey suit stitched in Naples, a blue silk tie, and a chinchilla overcoat that cost more than most men's cars. He did not smile. He did not wave. He didn't need to. The doorman opened without a word. The bellhops averted their eyes. Behind him, the city of New York kept breathing. But now, it breathed with him. Because by 1932, Charles Lucky Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was the CEO of American crime. The commission was no longer an idea. It was reality. Cold, deliberate, and structured. No more wars over bruised egos. No more bosses of bosses. Instead, there were meetings, votes, profit-sharing models, and silent handshakes behind closed restaurant doors. 6 families ruled under Luciano's framework. The Luciano family, his own. The Mangano family, soon to be led by Albert Anastasia. The Bonanno family. The Profassi family. The Galliano family, with Tommy Lucchese in the wings. And from the Midwest, Al Capone's Chicago outfit. Each had their territory. Each had their industries. But when decisions needed to be made, about hits, expansions, peace treaties, they came to the table, Luciano's table. He never raised his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. When he entered a room, men adjusted their posture. He had built something that couldn't be toppled by one bullet or one betrayal. Crime, under his rule, had rules. A code not of honor, but of logic. A corporation built on silence, fear, and money, but streamlined to perfection. The empire grew quickly, and it grew quietly. Prostitution was his most lucrative operation. He turned brothels into networks. Every girl had a ledger. Every madam had a quota. He taxed pimps like franchise managers. The earnings were obscene. Gambling flourished. Racetracks, dice games, poker rooms buried beneath soda fountains. Luciano's men supplied the cards, the chips, the muscle. Extortion, too, became an art form. Labor unions were bought. Judges leaned on. Dock workers and truck drivers paid weekly just to do their jobs in peace. Every man who touched $1 in New York eventually touched it through him. Then came narcotics. Though he claimed publicly to despise the drug trade, Luciano's network was deep into heroin by 1934, supplied through Marseille, processed in Sicily, and sold in American cities from Harlem to Chicago. His name never appeared on a document, but his fingerprint was on everything. With money came glamour. Luciano didn't hide in the shadows like Capone or wallow in violence like Dutch Schultz. He played the part of the gentleman gangster. Tailored suits, imported colognes, manicured nails. He dined at 21 Club, drank scotch at the Stork Club, and tipped heavy enough to be remembered. He dated showgirls, bought tickets in the front row, attended boxing matches in ringside tuxedos. A city once terrified of men like him now whispered about him with something close to awe. He lived in the Waldorf's luxury tower suite, once reserved for European nobility. The marble floors glistened, the windows overlooked Park Avenue like a king surveying his domain. The staff knew better than to ask questions. He owned no car, he never signed leases, he kept nothing in his own name. But everything was his. Hollywood came knocking, too. Producers sent scripts. Actresses sent photos. Some called him the gangster with manners. George Raft, who had grown up in the same slums, modelled characters after him. There were rumours that Luciano bankrolled a few films. Silent partnerships, quiet favours. He liked being admired. But admiration was not the goal. Control was. Every Sunday, he held private dinners. No bodyguards. Just 5 or 6 men at a table, drinking wine flown in from Naples, cigars resting in crystal trays. These meetings weren't about business. They were about loyalty, checking the temperature, listening for shifts in tone. It was at one of these dinners that he first mentioned a name out loud, one he'd heard repeated more and more in recent months. Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was young, clean-cut, and burning with righteousness. Manhattan's special prosecutor, a title invented just to give him power, had made a name-taking on corrupt unions and businessmen who played too close to the mob. Now he wanted something bigger, and Luciano, with his chinchilla coat and whispered mythos, was exactly the kind of man Dewey needed to bring down. At first, Luciano didn't take it seriously. Another ambitious kid with a badge and a headline fetish. But Dewey was relentless. He began targeting Luciano's brothels, not just the madams, the girls, the clients, the cabbies who drove them, the barkeeps who poured their drinks. He offered immunity in exchange for testimony. He applied pressure like a surgeon, not to kill, but to make someone talk. And someone did. In 1935, Dewey's case exploded. A single woman, a sex worker named Mildred, testified that she had paid protection money directly tied to Luciano's operation. Her voice shook. Her blouse was buttoned to the throat, but her words landed like thunder. Others followed. By the time Dewey walked into court, he had over 60 witnesses ready to speak. Luciano was indicted. The press devoured it. Still, Lucky remained calm. He flew to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a spa town known for its healing waters and corrupt police. He booked a room under an alias, dined with local judges, even posed for a photo in a cowboy hat, as if mocking the whole thing. But Dewey had reach. He had Luciano arrested in Arkansas and extradited back to New York under police escort. No luxury suite this time, no tailored suit, just handcuffs and silence. The trial began in 1936. Luciano sat in court every day, unreadable. He wore grey suits, his hair perfectly parted. He rarely moved, but the walls were closing in. The girls wept, the prosecutors thundered. And though his lawyers tore holes in their stories, the jury wasn't blind to the weight of the evidence, or the image of a man too polished to be clean. On June 7, 1936, Lucky Luciano was convicted on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in Dannemora prison. The newspapers had a field day. He took it without flinching. No statement, no appeal. Just a quiet ride north in a prison van, cuffed to a bench, the cold air of upstate New York settling into his bones like a slow betrayal. His reign was over, or so it seemed. But empires don't vanish in a day, even behind bars. Luciano's network held strong. He communicated through lawyers, coded letters, trusted lieutenants. The commission met without him, but his influence lingered in every deal, every handshake. He had built something too big to die, and in secret, he was already planning the next move. Back in Manhattan, Dewey rose to fame. He became district attorney, then governor, then presidential candidate. But even he would later admit, privately, off the record, that the case hadn't truly killed the beast. It had only moved it deeper underground. Lucky Luciano's fall wasn't the end of the empire. It was a warning that in a world built on control, the greatest enemy wasn't betrayal or ambition. It was exposure. And yet, even stripped of suits, even forgotten behind iron bars, Luciano remained what he had always been. A man who rewrote the rules. A gambler who bet on power. And for a time, had owned it all. It was a cold spring morning in Manhattan, March 1936. In the marble corridors of the Criminal Courts building on Center Street, the walls whispered of judgment. Reporters in trench coats loitered outside the courtroom, the air thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation. Inside, Charles, Lucky Luciano, sat quietly at the defense table, impeccably dressed, jaw set, hands folded. He looked like a man waiting for a business meeting to begin. But this wasn't business. This was war. And for the first time in a decade, he didn't control the battlefield. The charges were shocking to the public, running one of the largest prostitution rings in American history. The evidence? Thin. The strategy? Brilliant. Special prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey had built his case not on paper trails or wiretaps, but on testimony from the women themselves. More than 60 prostitutes took the stand. Some cried, some trembled. Many could barely look at Luciano as they recounted how money moved through hands, how the fear spread, how violence, sometimes distant, sometimes intimate, enforced control. No one claimed Luciano struck them. No one claimed he even visited the brothels, but the implication was clear. Nothing happened in New York without his say-so, and Dewey, sharp as a scalpel, knew how to carve narrative from shadow. Luciano's lawyers fought hard, dismissing the girls as coerced, discrediting dates and timelines. But the tide had turned. This wasn't just a trial. It was a statement, a message to every criminal organization that no man, no matter how polished or powerful, was above the law. When the verdict was read, Luciano didn't flinch. Guilty, 62 counts. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison. A king locked in a box. They sent him north, to Clinton Correctional Facility, better known as Dannemora, a fortress carved into the stone hills of upstate New York, the Siberia of the American prison system. Here, winter came early and stayed late. The cells were bare, the routines brutal, the air always cold, the walls always watching. It should have broken him, but Luciano didn't break. He adapted. He brought his structure with him. Even behind steel and concrete, his network held. Inmates deferred to him, guards respected him, or feared him. Packages arrived when he needed them. Conversations happened at his convenience. Favors flowed like heat through the pipes. He wasn't free, but he wasn't forgotten. Luciano still moved the pieces, even if he could no longer touch the board. Letters filtered out of Dannemora with a precision that felt like orchestration. They were coded, always respectful, always purposeful. Through intermediaries, he guided policy, smoothed disputes, approved or denied violence. The commission, still meeting in shadowed restaurants and quiet homes, knew better than to assume he was finished. Lucky was still the architect. Only now he ruled from a cell. And then war came. In 1942, the United States Navy faced a quiet, invisible threat. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, and rumors spread of sabotage along the East Coast docks. Ships caught fire. Cargo went missing. Whispers filled the air. Nazi agents had infiltrated the American ports. And in desperation, someone in naval intelligence asked the unthinkable, could the Mafia help? The answer came through a man named Meyer Lansky, still loyal, still dangerous. He arranged a quiet meeting between US, naval officials, and underworld figures who controlled the docks. The price? Luciano. Through intermediaries, Luciano agreed. He would assist in securing the ports. He would mobilize his people to prevent sabotage. In exchange, he wanted consideration, not for money, but for freedom. The government never publicly acknowledged it. But behind closed doors, they admitted the truth. The Mafia cleaned up the docks. No more fires, no more whispers, no more threats. And Luciano, he didn't walk free. But in 1946, his sentence was commuted. Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had built his name on Luciano's conviction, signed the papers. Not as an apology, as necessity, the condition, deportation. Luciano would never set foot on American soil again. They escorted him to Ellis Island, where he had first arrived 40 years earlier, as a frightened child with dust on his boots. Now he was escorted by armed agents, no longer feared, no longer untouchable, no longer home. He boarded a Navy vessel in silence. The engines groaned to life, and as the Manhattan skyline faded behind him, so too did the last illusion of return. He arrived in Naples with 2 suitcases, a tailored coat, and no country. Italy didn't want him. America had rejected him. And the empire he had built, the cities, the codes, the legacy, all of it kept moving without him. Luciano settled in a hotel overlooking the Bay of Naples. The view was beautiful. The silence was not. For the first time in his life, he was a spectator. His calls to New York were occasional, carefully placed. He passed messages through old friends, tested waters, watched from afar. He tried to organize again, a drug network, a distribution route. But the world had changed. The commission was now run by men younger than him, colder, more ambitious, more willing to spill blood than negotiate. Luciano's methods were clean. But the streets no longer cared for clean. In 1957, he flew to Havana under the pretense of a business deal. There, he hosted a summit of mob leaders from across the United States. It was one last show of influence, one last reminder that he still mattered. But when American authorities leaned on Batista's government, Luciano was forced to leave Cuba under pressure. His wings, once wide, were now clipped. Back in Italy, the days grew slower. He walked the streets of Naples alone. Sometimes noticed, often not. A gangster without a country, a king without a throne. On January 26, 1962, he was scheduled to meet with a film producer, interested in adapting his life into a movie. Luciano liked the idea. It meant he would be remembered. He dressed carefully. Pressed suit, polished shoes, cologne dabbed at the collar. He waited at the Naples airport, pacing near the arrivals gate. Then he collapsed. A massive heart attack. Dead before he hit the floor. The papers in America printed the headline: "Small, old gangster dies in exile. No ceremony, no parade." But back in New York, in the darker corners of Little Italy, the whispers traveled fast. Lucky was gone. And with him, something more. Not just a man, but an era. They buried him in Queens, in the family tomb at St. John's Cemetery. A small crowd gathered. No brass bands, no motorcades. Just a drizzle of rain on the polished casket, and a silence that felt heavier than grief. The marble was engraved simply. Charles Luciano, 1897 to 1962. Always a gentleman. He had started with nothing. No money, no country, no name. He died with no power, but a legacy etched deeper than concrete. Because every mob boss who came after him, every syndicate, every commission vote, every quiet handshake, all of it bore his fingerprints. Lucky Luciano didn't just play the game, he wrote the rules. The wiretap hissed faintly, a thread of static coiling through reel-to-reel tape. Then came the voice, soft, measured, almost grandfatherly. I want him to take a vacation, somewhere far, quiet. No names, no shouting, no threats, just calm instruction. Polite, almost warm. But the men listening, agents huddled in a back room of a Brooklyn precinct, leaned closer, stiffened, because they understood what vacation meant. And when Don Carlos spoke, men disappeared. It was 1963. The FBI had placed microphones in a modest home on Howard Beach, Queens. A brick house with trimmed hedges, white shutters, and an old Cadillac parked out front. From the outside, it looked like any other retiree's home. Inside, history was being whispered. Carlo Gambino didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like someone's quiet uncle. Grey cardigan, soft shoes, rosary on the nightstand. But for nearly a decade, he had run the most powerful criminal empire in America, and no one could prove it. He was the ghost at the center of it all. He rarely spoke in public. He never gave interviews. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He barely left a paper trail. He was not flashy like Capone, not theatrical like Genovese, not ruthless like Anastasia. But men followed him, and those who didn't. Rarely lasted long. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24th, 1902, in Cacamo, a small hilltop town in Sicily's Palermo province, a place where time moved slowly and secrets traveled in silence. His family was Honorata Societa, a lineage of quiet power and buried vendettas. By the age of 19, he was a made man. He wore black to weddings. He didn't ask questions. He never smiled in photos. In 1921, he arrived in America under a cousin's name. He was 20 years old, barely 5'7", thin, unremarkable, but already dangerous. Brooklyn, at the time, was a patchwork of immigrant enclaves. Italians in Bensonhurst, Jews in Brownsville, Irish in Red Hook. Power flowed through neighborhoods like currents, and Gambino understood how to swim beneath the surface. He didn't push for attention. He stayed close to family, close to structure. He joined the Mangano crime family, one of the original 5, where his loyalty was quiet but absolute. The boss, Vincent Mangano, was loud, brash, old world. Gambino nodded, listened, learned. But his real allegiance was to another man, Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was fire, Gambino was ice. Together, they balanced each other. One ruled through fear, the other through silence. Gambino rose quickly, not because he demanded it, but because he made himself indispensable. He handled numbers, he calmed tensions. He remembered every name, every debt, every betrayal, but never mentioned them. His silence was his voice. By the 1940s, he controlled bookmaking, extortion, and loan sharking operations across Brooklyn. The profits were steady, the arrests were rare. No one could pin a thing on him. He never signed ledgers, never made calls from home. He knew who was watching, and he played the long game. In 1951, Vincent Mangano vanished. His body was never found. Anastasia claimed power. Everyone knew it had been a coup. But Gambino, he said nothing. He kept his hands clean. When Anastasia took the throne, Gambino became underboss, the number 2 in the family, but number 1 in patience. Anastasia grew unstable. He demanded blood. He ordered hits for insults, sanctioned murders over petty debts. In 1957, he made a mistake. He had a man named Arnold Schuster killed, a civilian, a hero who had helped police catch a bank robber. The murder made front-page news. Politicians demanded answers. Even other mobsters winced. Gambino made a decision. He approached Vito Genovese. Together, they agreed. Anastasia had to go on October 25th, 1957. Albert Anastasia entered the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel. He sat in the chair, robe tied, hot towel over his face. Two men entered. No words, no warning. They fired multiple rounds. Anastasia staggered out of the chair, blinded, reaching toward a mirror. And then he fell. Days later, without fuss, Carlo Gambino stepped forward as boss. There was no coronation, no announcement, just nods in back rooms, and silence. From that moment, Gambino transformed the family. He removed hotheads, promoted men like Paul Castellano, thinkers, strategists, men who could manage like CEOs. He diversified rackets into construction, waste management, airports, real estate. He worked quietly with unions, bribed city inspectors, leveraged political contacts. The Gambino family became the most profitable, most stable, most feared in the nation. Not because of bullets, because of structure. Gambino didn't need attention. He lived modestly, no mansions, no limousines. Just a small home in Brooklyn, a wife he never cheated on, and Sunday dinners with family. He prayed every night. He paid in cash. He avoided cameras like disease. But when he spoke, things moved. He could end careers with a glance. He could save a life with a nod. He didn't shout because he didn't have to. By 1963, when that FBI wiretap caught him speaking in his soft voice, the agents realized something terrifying. This wasn't a man afraid of law. This was a man who understood law, who lived beneath it, who outlasted it. He didn't run from the FBI. He waited them out. There's a quote whispered through the underworld, often wrongly attributed to others, but it fits only one man. Power is not who speaks the loudest, it's who speaks last. Carlo Gambino spoke last, and the city listened. In the hills above Palermo, the morning light drapes the stone like parchment, ancient, sun-bleached, and silent. Olive trees sway in the breeze, their branches older than memory. The bells of the village chapel ring out slowly, not for ceremony, but for habit. And beneath them, in the town of Cacamo, a boy is watching. His name is Carlo. He is 10 years old, barefoot in the dust, standing at the edge of a courtyard where grown men kneel to kiss another man's hand. The man receiving the gesture doesn't speak. He only nods. Carlo doesn't blink. Because even at 10, he understands what he's seeing. Power, not loud, not theatrical, just absolute. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24th, 1902, into a world already steeped in hierarchy. His family belonged to the old structure, a line of quiet men who followed the unwritten rules of Honorata Societa, the honored society. He was taught early that secrets were sacred, that silence was a form of survival, and that the most powerful man in a room was often the one who said the least. There were no parades in Cacamo, no cheers for ambition, only trust and fear and memory. And Carlo remembered everything. By 17, he was already serving under Don Gaetano Trainer, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in Western Sicily. He didn't carry a knife, he didn't swagger, but he ran errands with a precision that made men notice. By 19, he took his oath. A pin was pushed into his finger. A prayer was recited over a saint's image, blood mixed with ash and fire. He was now uomo d'onore, a man of honor. But honor, in Sicily, came with limitation. Sicilian blood feuds were endless. Vendettas swallowed entire families. And as Mussolini's fascist crackdown began spreading through the countryside, Carlo saw what his uncles wouldn't. The old way was no longer safe. He made a choice. In 1921, he boarded a freighter to America under his cousin Paolo's name. The ship groaned across the Atlantic, its hull lined with the dreams of the hungry, the hunted, and the ambitious. Carlo brought no suitcase, only a soft cap, a coat, and the code in his blood. When he arrived at Ellis Island, he gave his name as P. Gambino, and let the officials believe what they needed to believe. He stepped into Brooklyn without fanfare, but he never looked back. Brooklyn in the 1920s was something between a battlefield and a marketplace. Every street corner had a story. Every stoop had a watcher. In Bensonhurst, the Italian enclaves were thick with immigrant pain, mothers scrubbing laundry on their knees, fathers broken by shipyard labor. But underneath, the old structures re-emerged. Men like Salvatore De Killer and Vincent Mangano were carving out empires from black market liquor, gambling dens, and union extortion. And Carlo, barely 20, knew how to find his place without asking for it. He didn't beg for entry. He didn't boast about Sicily. He simply made himself useful. He started under Vincent Mangano's shadow, a man who ruled with thunder but relied on whispers. Carlo worked the numbers, collected debts, managed disputes. He never hit someone who could be paid instead, never raised his voice when a stare would do. He kept clean books. He kept silent. He kept moving. By the time Prohibition hit its stride, Gambino had already buried his Sicilian accent beneath fluent Brooklynese, but he never forgot who he was, and never allowed anyone else to forget it either. While other soldiers made noise, flashing cars, chasing chorus girls, pouring whiskey like water, Gambino observed. He learned who bribed which judges. He learned which cops looked away, and which ones wanted envelopes. And most importantly, he learned how to build power without being seen holding it. He married young, to Catherine Castellano, the cousin of Paul Castellano. It wasn't a love story, it was a strategy. Paul would become his brother-in-law, and in time, his successor. Carlo didn't speak of family in public, but in private, every thread wove into his web. He showed up to weddings. He paid for funerals. He remembered birthdays, visited hospitals, kissed hands with humility. People called him the man who always looked like he had nothing to prove. And that was the point. While gang wars raged between Mustache Pete's and upstart Jews in the Bronx, Gambino avoided it all. He didn't care about public victories. He cared about control. He took over policy rackets. He infiltrated the garment district. He made his bones without leaving a trail. In 1931, when the dust settled after the Maranzano assassination, and Lucky Luciano restructured the five families, Gambino wasn't at the front of the table, but he was already feeding men at it. He understood that longevity required invisibility, that others be legends. He would be legacy. By the early 1940s, he was officially a capo regime, overseeing his own crew in South Brooklyn. His men rarely got pinched. Their books were lean. The money flowed up. Quietly, predictably. He didn't drink. He didn't chase women. He read the paper every morning. He wrote nothing down. When FBI agents began compiling files in the late 40s, they had pages on Genovese, Anastasia, Costello. On Gambino, barely a paragraph. No arrests. No known addresses. Just one note. Considered highly respected, never speaks out of turn. That was how he wanted it. He once told a young associate over coffee, "If they know your name, you're already losing." And for decades, the public didn't know his name, but every man in the life did. He became known as the Stoic, not because he never felt, but because he never showed. He'd walk into a room and sit in the corner, say nothing, just listen. And when the time came, he'd speak just once, a sentence, maybe two, and it would change everything. Power, to Gambino, wasn't noise, it was gravity. And he carried it with him, not on his shoulders, but in his eyes. Quiet, steady, unblinking. From Palermo to Brooklyn, he never once broke character, not out of fear, but because he knew the greatest strength in a violent world was control. It was October 25th, 1957, a quiet Friday morning in Midtown Manhattan. Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter they called him, stepped into the Park Sheraton Hotel, walked into the barbershop, and took a seat in the second chair. He nodded to the barber, removed his jacket, loosened his tie. The white sheet was drawn across his chest. The towel, warm and damp, was placed across his eyes. The blades were soaking in alcohol. Outside, traffic whispered past the windows. Inside, two men entered. No words, no warning. In under 90 seconds, Albert Anastasia was shot 5 times. Twice in the head, 3 in the torso. One round shattered the mirror. He died facing, shards reflecting the blood pooling beneath the chair. By the time the barber pulled away the towel, it was over. The king had fallen. And the man who said nothing, who always waited, was already in place to take the crown. Carlo Gambino didn't fire a bullet. He didn't stand outside. He wasn't even in the city that day. And yet, he orchestrated the silence that followed. To understand how he got there, you have to go back to the Brooklyn streets of the late 1930s, when Gambino was still a capo in the Mangano family, and the syndicate was undergoing a transformation. This was the era of Murder, Inc., a name the press loved, a structure the underworld relied on. Dozens of contract killers, mostly Jewish and Italian, headquartered in a candy store on Saratoga Avenue in Brownsville, Brooklyn. The front man was Louis Lepke Buchalter, the brain behind the scenes, Albert Anastasia. They were ghosts in suits, over 400 murders tied to them, and not a single witness ever spoke. But while Anastasia relished the blood, Gambino watched from a distance. He didn't object to the killings. He understood the necessity, but he never liked the noise. Anastasia was unpredictable, brilliant, yes, loyal sometimes, but impulsive. He screamed at sit-downs, demanded violence when silence would do. He threatened civilians, sanctioned hits without approval, and cultivated a kind of mythic violence that the Commission had begun to outgrow after World War II, when the American mafia sought to become sleeker, more corporate. Anastasia felt like a man out of time. Gambino took note. By 1951, after the suspicious disappearance of Vincent Mangano, Anastasia had assumed control of the family, with Gambino as his underboss. Outwardly, they were aligned. Inwardly, Gambino waited. He kept the books clean, kept disputes minimal, ensured revenue flowed up. But he was building something else in the shadows. Alliances, quiet meetings, soft promises spoken between cigars and handshakes. Vito Genovese was one of them. The old rival of Frank Costello, always reaching, never satisfied. He wanted Costello gone. Gambino wanted Anastasia removed. And so the two men made a deal without ever calling it one. Genovese would handle Costello, Gambino would deal with Anastasia. Neither would use the Commission's approval, because some decisions were bigger than rules. In May 1957, Costello survived an assassination attempt. A bullet grazed his scalp, but he lived. Still, he saw the message clearly, and stepped down as boss of the Luciano family. Genovese moved up. Now it was Gambino's turn. Anastasia had gone too far. In March 1957, he had allegedly ordered the murder of Arnold Schuster, a civilian, a clean-cut Brooklyn man who had helped police capture a fugitive. Schuster had appeared on television. Anastasia, watching the segment from his living room, allegedly snarled, "I can't stand squealers, hit that guy." And so, the story goes, he did. Schuster was found dead with multiple gunshots in the gut. The killing was reckless, unjustified in every sense. It brought public outcry, media attention, and heat from federal authorities. Even within the mafia, the reaction was disbelief. Gambino kept his face blank. But the decision had been made. Anastasia had to go. He didn't bring the matter to a vote, didn't shout, didn't call in favors. Instead, he made arrangements. The shooters were chosen carefully. Outsiders, some say Joe Gallo orchestrated the logistics. Others claim the triggermen were flown in. No one was ever arrested. And that was the point. No evidence, no noise, no trail. Just execution. Clean after Anastasia's murder in the barbershop. A power vacuum formed. But not for long. Within weeks, Gambino quietly stepped into the role of boss. There was no war, no dissent, because by then, everyone understood something fundamental. He had already been running things for years. He changed the name of the family, from Mangano to Gambino, not as a declaration, but as a signature, subtle, permanent. He reorganized the leadership structure. Paul Castellano rose through the ranks. Neil Della Croce handled enforcement. Unions were fortified, ports secured, airport contracts expanded. Every inch of business was reviewed, streamlined, and quietly enforced. And yet, the public still didn't know his face. Unlike Luciano or Genovese, Gambino kept out of headlines. He forbade drugs, or claimed to. At the very least, he made sure he was never connected to them. He frowned on flash, avoided high-end parties, discouraged unnecessary violence. If a problem arose, it was handled discreetly. A transfer here, a talk there. If necessary, a disappearance. But only when absolutely required. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover didn't even publicly acknowledge the mafia's existence until 1957, the same year Gambino assumed power. By then, it was too late. Gambino had already become the most powerful boss in the country, and he'd done it without firing a shot at the Appalachian meeting in November 1957, a failed summit of over 100 mobsters that ended in police raids. Gambino wasn't arrested. He escaped through the woods, coat torn, shoes muddy. But he returned to New York unscathed. The bosses who were caught saw their reputations tarnished. Gambino's only grew stronger. He'd survived again. Quietly, expertly, invisibly. There's a moment recalled by an informant years later. A sit-down in a Brooklyn social club. Two young associates argued over a territory dispute. Voices raised, tempers flaring. Then Gambino, seated in the back, cleared his throat. He didn't say a word, didn't gesture, just made a sound. Soft, brief, controlled. The room fell silent. One of the men apologized. The matter ended. Power didn't need to shout. It only needed to exist. Gambino had watched murdering rise and fall. He'd witnessed Anastasia's mistakes. He'd studied the weaknesses of Flash and Fury. And in the end, he built an empire that would last longer than any of theirs. Not because he ruled with fear, but because he ruled with discipline, with calculation, with patience. In the years after Anastasia's death, the Gambino family became the model. Structured, profitable, insulated. And Carlo, always watching, always listening, sat at the center of it all, still in Brooklyn, still in that modest home, still the man who never raised his voice. Because he never had to, on a quiet block in Brooklyn, an old man shuffled down the steps of a modest brick house every Sunday morning. Pressed slacks, beige cardigan, polished shoes. He'd nod to neighbors, tip the paperboy. Sometimes he carried a Bible, sometimes a folded New York Times. He never needed a bodyguard, and he never needed to raise his voice. That man, quiet, soft-spoken, forgettable to anyone passing by, controlled more of America than any elected official ever would. His name was Carlo Gambino, and this was his golden age. From the late 1950s through the early 1970s, Gambino built a criminal empire so vast, so seamless, and so insulated that even the FBI couldn't fully map its reach. While other bosses fell to wiretaps, indictments, and hubris, Gambino stayed one step ahead, always watching, always adjusting. He didn't control streets. He controlled systems, unions, ports, construction, trucking, casinos, labor boards, judges, inspectors, freight terminals, the garment district, JFK Airport. From warehouses in Newark to loading docks in Miami, the Gambino family collected off every crate, contract, and paycheck. Not through violence, through structure. It began with the docks. The International Longshoremen's Association was a gold mine. Tens of thousands of workers, millions of tons of cargo. Gambino placed his people at every level. Union reps, stewards, enforcers. A container didn't move unless Gambino got a cut. One FBI agent later remarked. He controlled the flow of goods like a central bank controlled currency. And it wasn't just ports. Trucking companies paid for routes. Garment factories paid for silence. Contractors paid for speed. And everyone paid to avoid problems. Gambino never screamed in a meeting. He didn't need to. He'd listen for 20 minutes, then end the conversation with a nod or a single word. That was enough. His lieutenants, men like Paul Castellano, Aniello Neil Della Croce, and Joseph N. Gallo, handled day-to-day operations. Each man had a role. Each man reported upward. And Gambino remained at the center, invisible. Unlike his contemporaries, Gambino never allowed his name to become larger than his control. Genovese was feared, but he ended up behind bars. Costello was elegant, but he took a bullet to the head and stepped down. Lucchese was smart, but even he couldn't build what Gambino did. Carlo's genius was restraint. He forbade drug trafficking within the family, not out of morality, but because of federal attention. The FBI focused on heroin, so Gambino focused on everything else. He'd quietly allow other families to touch drugs, collect tribute without liability. He understood the difference between money and risk, and he always chose power over greed. While others drove Cadillacs and lived in white marble mansions, Gambino stayed in the same house on Ocean Parkway. 2 stories, modest lawn, simple furniture. He gave Christmas gifts in person, attended every wedding and wake. He was there, not above his men, but among them. It created a culture, one where loyalty wasn't demanded. It was felt. The FBI tried everything. Phone taps, wire bugs, informants. But Gambino said almost nothing over the phone. He used couriers, face-to-face meetings, quiet drives with trusted capos, where windows stayed open and engines stayed off. When the feds planted a microphone in his home, they heard mostly silence, or, at most, quiet Italian murmurs over coffee and pasta. One report noted, the subject discussed nothing criminal in 3 weeks of continuous surveillance. Because Gambino didn't discuss crime, he moved within it. In 1966, law enforcement tried to build a racketeering case through the waterfront. A task force of agents was assigned to track Gambino-linked activity at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and Manhattan piers. They found whispers, they found fear, but they found no names on contracts, no signed orders, no fingerprints. It was like trying to arrest smoke. Even the IRS, hungry for an angle, couldn't pin him down. His income was modest, his taxes minimal but clean, no suspicious bank accounts, no flashy spending. His fortune, estimated well into the hundreds of millions, remained hidden in a network of shell companies, cash bundles, and favors. It couldn't be traced, and so it couldn't be taken. Other bosses, like Joe Colombo, made headlines. Colombo even founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, held rallies, gave interviews, put himself on TV. Gambino watched quietly. And when Colombo was shot in the head at a rally in 1971, Gambino said nothing, just continued business as usual. Power, for him, was never in display. It was in control, he once told a young associate during a rare moment of candor. The loud man is already exposed, the man they don't notice. That's the man who lasts. And he lasted, decades, through trials, indictments, wars, and presidents. He outmaneuvered Vito Genovese. He outlived Frank Costello. He outclassed every rival, because he never played their game. He didn't smoke. He didn't gamble. He didn't flaunt. He had one vice: order. Everything in its place. Everyone in their role. If a man stepped out of line, quietly, without spectacle, he disappeared. No public body count. No bombs. Just silence. Even internally, Gambino held the family in balance. Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, ran the white-collar side. Della Croce ran the street crews. They didn't always get along, but Gambino kept them both close. 2 hands of the same body. It was a chessboard. And every move had been prepared years in advance. By 1970, the Gambino family had over 500 made men and thousands of associates. They influenced industries across 17 states. If you poured concrete in New York, built a bridge in Jersey, or unloaded a crate in Miami, there was a cut for Carlo. Yet his name never appeared in a headline, only whispered and feared. The FBI called him the Godfather, but never said it aloud in court, because they couldn't prove it. To the public, he was a retired businessman. To his men, he was the voice behind the curtain. To his enemies, he was a ghost who knew everything before you moved. And to himself, he was simply in control. There was a moment in 1972, just a moment, when it almost fell apart. A rising informant, deeply embedded in the union world, came forward with recordings, names, movements. There were talks of grand juries, headlines brewing, but the tapes vanished. The witness was transferred. No trial followed. And once again, Gambino survived. Because systems were harder to kill than people. And Carlo Gambino was a system. He grew older, but never weaker. At 70, he still met with capos twice a week. Still reviewed operations. Still kept the same black leather notebook. Small, unmarked. Always tucked inside his jacket. By then, law enforcement knew they'd never touch him. But they still watched, listened, waited, and found nothing. The golden age of Carlo Gambino was not built on spectacle. It was built on patience, on listening more than speaking, on legacy, not ego. He didn't want to be remembered as a myth. He wanted to never be forgotten as a master. And that, quietly, invisibly, is exactly what he became. He rose at the same hour every morning. No alarm clock, no one to wake him. Just instinct. Carlo Gambino, 70 years old, slippers on, robe cinched, rosary beads on the nightstand, sat by the kitchen window of his Ocean Parkway home and sipped his espresso slowly, like he had every morning for the last 4 decades. The street outside was quiet. The paperboy hadn't come yet. But the old man was already working. He listened. to the wind, to the creaks in the pipes, to the distant rhythm of footsteps on pavement. He didn't need a calendar to know time was running short, because even legends feel when the end is near. By the early 1970s, Gambino had outlasted them all. Vito Genovese was dead in prison. Frank Costello had faded into retirement. Joe Colombo was paralyzed by a bullet to the head. Even law enforcement had changed. The FBI now publicly acknowledged the existence of the mafia. The commission was monitored. RICO laws were closing in. Wiretaps had replaced bullets. But Gambino was still free. He'd never been convicted, never wore handcuffs, never spent a single night behind bars. And yet, in those final years, he began doing something rare for a man like him. He began thinking about what would happen when he was gone. His health was failing. A weak heart, frequent hospital visits, doctors whispering behind closed doors. But his mind remained sharp, and his instincts sharper. He knew that empires don't collapse from pressure, they collapse from succession. And so, Carlo Gambino made a decision, one that would echo louder in death than anything he ever did in life. He bypassed his blood. He had sons, nephews, trusted relatives. But instead, he chose his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. It wasn't sentimental, it wasn't political, it was structural. Castellano was calm, methodical, financially astute. He understood white-collar rackets, construction, concrete, union pensions. He spoke the language of judges and CEOs. He was, in Gambino's eyes, the natural continuation of his vision. Power without noise. But not everyone agreed. Neil Della Croce, the family's underboss, was the opposite of Castellano. Old school, street-born, respected in the crews, feared by rivals. He bled loyalty and demanded it in return. To pass over him was, to many, a slap in the face. But Gambino, ever the architect, saw something few others did. The future would be fought in boardrooms, not back alleys. And Castellano would be the one to win those wars. He gave Della Croce a role. Keep the street crews in line. Let Castellano handle the business. 2 wings, 1 family. A careful balance. But balances don't hold forever. In 1975, Gambino began withdrawing from active meetings. He stayed home more, delegated more, took longer pauses between his few words. But his presence still loomed. Even in absence, men behaved differently when they remembered who built the walls around them. When he did appear at social clubs, shoulders hunched, eyes sunken, the room would still fall silent, not out of pity, out of reverence. The Dons still breathed. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino died in his home, surrounded by family. No bullets, no sirens, no exile. Just a quiet end in the house he never left. A stillness wrapped in linen sheets, with the smell of espresso still lingering in the kitchen. The funeral was held at Our Lady of Grace Church in Brooklyn. There were no headlines, only whispers. The NYPD stationed dozens of officers along the procession route, not to protect the public, but to count who came. Over 2,000 mourners arrived. Capos, soldiers, associates, rivals, judges, politicians. Some bowed their heads. Some kissed the casket. All paid respect, because the man they buried wasn't just a boss, he was the boss. The last of a kind that no longer existed. They lowered him into the ground at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, near Luciano, near Costello. The marble was simple. Carlo Gambino, 1902 to 1976, beloved husband and father. But beneath the soil lay something more. Not just a man, but a philosophy. A life lived through restraint. An empire built through patience. A legend written in silence. What made Carlo Gambino different wasn't his wealth. Others had fortunes. What made him different wasn't his longevity. Others lived long, too. What made him different was that he never once had to run. Not from bullets, not from courtrooms, not from history. He moved through the world like mist, shaping it without ever needing to explain how. A man who outlived war, betrayal, informants, FBI task forces, surveillance and ambition, because he understood something most gangsters never do, that survival isn't about dominance, it's about control. Years after his death, agents would still pull his name from old files, looking for cracks, looking for clues, but they found only questions. How did he stay untouched? How did he hold the country's most powerful crime family together for 2 decades and leave it stronger than when he took it? No clear answers, only silence. And silence, in the end, was the mark he left behind. They call him the Quiet Don, the ghost who walked in daylight, the man who never needed a throne, because the entire room was already his. It was 1958, inside a federal courtroom in downtown Manhattan. The room buzzed with subdued tension, a dull hum of shuffling papers, coughing jurors, and low whispers beneath flickering fluorescence. On the witness stand sat a man who was supposed to be untouchable, a union boss testifying under federal immunity. On the prosecution's table, a dozen names were listed, many of them whispered but never spoken aloud in courtrooms. But the jurors weren't looking at the witness. They were looking at the man sitting silently at the defense table. A courtroom sketch captured it perfectly. He wasn't big, wasn't loud, wasn't young. Tommy Lucchese leaned forward slightly, his head tilted. A patient smile curved across his lips. His hands were folded, one atop the other. And even in black ink, you could see the deformity. His pinky finger, stiff and twisted, pointed slightly off-center from the rest of his hand. A childhood injury. A factory accident, a mangled joint from long ago. But in that moment, it was more than a scar. It was a symbol, a reminder that this man, Three Finger Brown, as the streets sometimes called him, had built an empire from grit, steel, and strategy. An empire no one had seen coming. Born Gaetano Lucchese on December 1st, 1899, in Palermo, Sicily, Tommy's earliest memories were of tools. His father, a shoemaker, worked in a narrow workshop carved into the back of their home. The smell of leather and glue stained the air. Hammers echoed off stone walls. Money was tight, but pride was tighter. When Tommy was 10, the family left for America, part of the great wave of southern Italian immigrants chasing a promise that always seemed to shimmer just out of reach. They settled in East Harlem, a neighborhood built on fire escapes, broken English, and ambition stitched together by poverty. Tommy didn't go far in school. His English was passable, his frame slight. He learned early that power didn't come from books. It came from knowing when to smile, and when not to. He took work in a machine shop as a teenager, sweeping floors, carrying bolts, sorting scrap. It was there that a piece of equipment malfunctioned, crushing part of his right hand. He lost movement in the pinky. A surgeon said it would be a permanent deformity. The other boys called him Crooked Claw. Tommy never corrected them. He just kept working. By 16, he had moved from the shop floor to the sidewalk rackets. He joined the 107th Street Gang, a crew of mostly Italian kids working under Gaetano Reina, a Bronx-based bootlegger with quiet connections. Tommy was different from the others. He didn't drink, didn't flash, didn't crave chaos. He watched. He learned. He became the guy who knew where the money flowed, where the cops walked, which judges liked cigars, and which numbers never showed up twice on a ledger. It wasn't long before Rayner took him in as more than muscle. Prohibition hit in 1920. For most gangs, it was a gold rush. For Tommy, it was infrastructure. He built distribution networks. He brokered deals between Sicilian outfits and Jewish crews. He avoided turf wars, even when insulted, because he understood that ego was expensive. He earned faster than men twice his age. But nothing in New York stayed calm for long. In 1930, Rayner was murdered in the brewing conflict between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. The war was blood-soaked and bitter, with betrayals carved into concrete. Tommy knew the tides were shifting. He aligned himself with Lucky Luciano, a move that changed everything. When Luciano and his allies took out both Masseria and Maranzano in 1931 and established the 5 families, Lucchese emerged as underboss of the newly named Galliano family. Not flashy, not loud, but essential. The press didn't notice him, but his peers did. He didn't shout orders. He whispered them. He didn't demand tribute. He structured it. And slowly, he transformed his crew into a corporate machine. He focused on labor, the garment district, factories, seamstresses, distribution trucks. It became his kingdom. Every button, every stitch, every shipment from Midtown to the Bronx passed through his system. Unions bent to him. Strikes ended with a phone call. Wages were decided in diners over black coffee. no fingerprints, no flash. Just influence. In the 1940s, Lucchese expanded into trucking, then construction, then the airports. LaGuardia, Idlewild, later JFK. He had the baggage handlers, the maintenance contracts, the food vendors, the security. Nothing moved without his cut. He could delay a flight, reroute cargo, or make a shipment disappear without ever leaving his house. And still, he smiled. Still, he lived modestly. A suburban home in Lido Beach, Long Island. A black Buick. A small circle of loyalists. He hosted Sunday dinners, visited hospitals, knew every Kaipo's birthday, sent flowers to widows before the obituaries were printed. He was a boss, but he never acted like he had something to prove. That, in itself, was power. By 1951, when Tommy Galliano died, Lucchese quietly stepped in as boss of the family, which now bore his name. No vote, no war, no press, just transition. From 1951 to the end of his life, Tommy Lucchese sat atop one of the most profitable mafia organizations in the country. He managed alliances with the Gambino family, especially Carlo, whom he deeply respected. He brokered peace between warring factions. He watched as younger men destroyed themselves with ego and ambition. He outlived many of them. The FBI knew who he was, but they couldn't touch him. In hearings, he said little, always polite, always vague. Even that 1958 courtroom appearance, the one from the sketch, ended without charge. He'd lean in, smile, fold his crippled hand across the table and say, "I'm just a businessman. I know a lot of people, that's all." And no one could prove otherwise. His hand, once the source of ridicule, became his trademark. A quiet defiance, proof that wounds don't stop men like him. They shape them. Tommy Lucchese didn't need an army. He didn't need a throne. He had something rarer, a network that ran on respect. And behind it all, the man with the crooked pinky never lost control. Not once. The shop was always warm, even in winter, when the Harlem wind sliced through coats and rattled the window glass. The little cobbler's bench in the back of their tenement apartment seemed to hold onto the heat. Gaetano Lucchese, known to the world much later as Tommy, would sit on the floor as a boy, knees hugged to his chest, watching his father shape the world with nothing but thread, leather, and silence. The rhythm of the awl, the scrape of the blade, the hiss of glue heating over flame. It wasn't just a trade, it was a code. Quiet, disciplined, and precise. Tommy never forgot that. He was born in Palermo in December of 1899, a city that bore scars older than the century. There, tradition carried more weight than law. Pride mattered more than prosperity. But when famine clawed through Sicily's hills and jobs withered like spoiled fruit, the Lucchese family did what thousands of others did. They left in 1911, when Tommy was just 11. They arrived in New York with 2 suitcases, one family name, and no promise of safety. They landed in East Harlem, a world stacked on itself in brick and rust. The city didn't soften for them. It didn't offer warmth. It offered motion, noise, dust, tenements that groaned when the trains passed, streets that smelled of coal, butcher scraps, and ambition. Young Gaetano had no patience for school. English came slow, and with it, frustration. He didn't like being laughed at, didn't like repeating himself. So he left formal education behind. Instead, he worked. Errands, deliveries, scrap runs, factory shifts when he could fake the age. It was in a machine shop, not far from 116th Street, that the accident happened. A conveyor belt jammed. A split second of hesitation. His right pinky finger was caught, crushed, and rendered useless. The boys teased him, said he looked like a scarecrow, like a claw, like a freak. He didn't flinch, didn't respond. Tommy simply pocketed the pain, the way a cobbler might store scraps for later. He found refuge where most street kids did, in numbers. By his teens, he was running with the 107th Street Gang, a tight-knit collection of Italian boys who'd learned that respect wasn't inherited. It was carved out with fists, favors, and silence. The patron was Gaetano Reyna, a man with old Sicilian instincts and new American opportunity. Reyna operated from the Bronx, steering bootlegging routes and ice distribution with measured brutality. Tommy caught his eye for a reason that had nothing to do with strength. He never spoke out of turn. He never asked for more than he earned. And he always remembered names, even of men he had no reason to remember. Most kids in the neighborhood wanted to be seen. Tommy learned early. It was better to be needed. He ran messages. He managed numbers. He memorized routes, schedules, faces. If Rayner wanted to know which cops were taking envelopes or which trucks weren't pulling their weight, Tommy had an answer. Never rushed, always accurate. There were rumors that Rayner called him Il ragazzo che ascolta, the boy who listens. When Prohibition hit in 1920, Harlem's alleys turned into rivers of potential. Alcohol flowed from Canada, upstate distilleries, even small kitchens in Queens. The city cracked wide open, and every gang, syndicate, and neighborhood crew tried to drink from the same glass. Rayner needed men who could move quietly, cut deals, and avoid blood where possible. Tommy was perfect. He helped map supply routes from the Bronx down through Manhattan, smoothing tensions with Jewish crews and Irish wholesalers. He wasn't the man who knocked on doors with bats. He was the man who arranged a dinner, and made sure no one walked away angry or broke. By 1925, he was no longer just a kid. He dressed clean, dark jackets, crisp collars, polished shoes. He still carried himself like a worker, but he spoke like a broker. People took notice. He started carrying a notebook, not for numbers, but for names, delivery times, places he needed to be. It was said he never forgot a face, a favor, or a slight. He never had to raise his voice. But quiet men still bleed in loud wars. In 1930, Gaetano Rayner was murdered. Some said it was Masseria's doing. Joe, the boss, who wanted absolute control over all Italian rackets in New York. Others said it was betrayal from within. It didn't matter. The underworld fractured overnight. The Castellammarese War erupted, pitting Joe Masseria against Salvatore Maranzano in a vicious contest that would paint curbs in blood. Tommy could have disappeared, could have walked away and gone into construction, dry goods, or any other line of work. But he didn't. He pledged loyalty, not to a flag or to vengeance, but to a man he trusted, Tommy Galliano. Galliano was soft-spoken, but firm, much like Lucchese. Together, they formed the backbone of what would soon become the Galliano family, one of the original 5 families of the American Mafia. Lucchese wasn't boss. He didn't want to be. He was underboss. And he was exact. While other crews scrambled for attention, Lucchese built a structure. He recruited men who didn't crave the spotlight, men who understood schedules, discipline, the rhythm of labor. He forged ties with labor unions, not just for the money, but for the control. He made sure that trucks moved when they were supposed to. The picket lines didn't erupt unless he wanted them to. The politicians knew his number and owed him for using it. All the while, he stayed out of the newspapers. He wasn't photographed drunk in clubs, wasn't indicted for reckless violence. He moved like a shadow at midday, visible only to those who knew where to look. And if they looked closely enough, they'd see that hand, the one with the bent pinky, curled slightly like a question mark. Some said it was a reminder that even something broken could still grip power. By 1931, when Luciano and his allies eliminated both Masseria and Maranzano, the war ended. The commission was born. A new era of organized crime began. Structured, hierarchical, corporate. And Tommy Lucchese, the shoemaker's son, the boy with the crooked hand, stood silently near the center. He hadn't fired the shots. He hadn't worn the crown. But he had survived. And more importantly, he had planned. His crew expanded. Garment trucks, garages, porters' unions. Even small cafes that handled messages for the families. Nothing flashy, just foundation. Lucchese believed in building slow, the way his father once hammered soles into shoes, checking the grain of the leather, aligning the seams. He understood that power wasn't about fear. It was about consistency. If you paid him, your trucks ran. If you crossed him, your wheels stopped. And stayed stopped. He never forgot where he came from. On Sundays, he visited his mother. He donated to local churches, always anonymously. And on more than one occasion, he paid for the funeral of a friend's mother, or the wedding of a distant cousin. Not because it bought loyalty, but because it preserved legacy. In his world, reputation was armor, and memory was currency. The city would come to know Tommy Lucchese in later years as a labor kingmaker, a strategist, even a diplomat among thieves. But it all began in a tenement shop, where leather bent beneath his father's hands. It began with a crushed pinky and the silence that followed. It began with Rayner's death. and a choice. Not to flee, but to build. And it began with loyalty. Not the loud, oath-swearing kind. The quiet kind. The kind you prove every day, without asking for applause. In the spring of 1946, a customs inspector working the docks of Hoboken noticed something strange. 2 trucks rolled in, hours before the manifest called for them. No paperwork, no guards, just uniformed porters moving crates with surprising ease. He raised a hand to stop one. The driver met his eyes and said quietly, "This one's paid for." The inspector hesitated, then stepped aside. By the time he reported it, the trucks were gone. No trace, no complaint, just a single name whispered in the dock office later that night. Lucchese, by the 1940s, Tommy. Lucchese had mastered a different kind of power. Not the kind that kicks indoors or leaves bodies in alleyways. That had its place, yes, but not in his world. Tommy preferred to make a phone call, or have lunch, or say nothing at all. He was the underboss of the Galliano crime family. Quiet, invisible, but everywhere. And under his watch, the family became less like a street gang and more like a corporation. It started with the unions. While other bosses tried to control rackets with violence, Lucchese studied the infrastructure. He understood that labor moved the city, and whoever moved labor moved money. He infiltrated the garment district first, not through threats, but through routine. Truck drivers, sewing machine mechanics, porters and floor managers. He sent envelopes, helped settle disputes, quietly solved problems the police ignored. By the time union bosses realized what had happened, they were sitting across from him in midtown cafes, asking for advice. Lucchese didn't demand loyalty. He made himself indispensable. And once they needed him, he rewrote the rules. By 1943, over 90% of garment shipments in New York were touched, directly or indirectly, by people in Lucchese's pocket. A factory that delayed his trucks would find their drivers on strike. A warehouse that cooperated suddenly had no picket lines, no missing shipments, no trouble. What he built wasn't chaos, it was a system, but labor was just the beginning. He turned his eye toward the airports, LaGuardia, Idlewild, which would later be renamed JFK. He worked the ground crews first, then the loaders, then the officials who cleared cargo manifests. Lucchese understood the power of access, and once his men were inside the gates, money began to flow, not in suitcases, but in control. If a shipment needed to be misplaced, it vanished. If it needed to appear, it landed early. Everything was accounted for, until it wasn't. What made Lucchese dangerous wasn't just what he controlled, but how little noise he made doing it. Other bosses courted fear. Lucchese courted reliability. He was a solution, a fixer. He didn't yell. He nodded. Didn't threaten. He calculated. And slowly, politicians began to notice. City council members, state representatives, men who wore American flag pins and gave speeches about public safety. They all took his calls. Sometimes he offered campaign donations, discreet, of course. Sometimes he helped turn out union votes. Sometimes he simply listened. By the end of the decade, several city departments, from building permits to sanitation contracts, were indirectly influenced by Lucchese's recommendations. No one ever proved it, but city planners learned quickly. If you wanted trucks to run on time, or scaffolding to stay up, it was better to check with the right people. Lucchese didn't believe in ethnic lines, either. Not when it came to business. He had learned early that money didn't care what language you prayed in. So he built bridges with Jewish racketeers like Meyer Lansky and Longies Willman. Lucchese coordinated casino investments, garment kickbacks, and political lobbying strategies that reached into Albany. With Irish fixers like James "Jimmy the Shiv" Coonan, he brokered shipping contracts and contract enforcement deals that kept the ports moving. His meetings weren't marked on calendars. His name wasn't on memos, but he was there, always in the second booth, always with 2 drinks. One for the man who owed him, and one for the man who didn't yet know he would. One of his greatest moves came in 1957, when he threw quiet support behind Carlo Gambino, helping him edge out Albert Anastasia in a silent war for the future of organized crime. Lucchese didn't raise a hand in the bloodshed. But when Anastasia was gunned down in a barbershop chair and Gambino stepped in to take the reins, it was Lucchese who smiled calmly from across the room. He had picked the right horse. Again, even his friendship with Luciano, exiled, untouchable, and yet still powerful, was carefully curated. Lucchese never overreached, never used Luciano's name for clout. But he sent messages, kept the channels open. When Luciano needed someone to manage business stateside, Lucchese made sure it was done. Not for glory, not for headlines, for balance. He understood what few men did. That crime, real, sustainable, generational crime, was not about dominance, it was about structure. And so, beneath the blinking lights of New York's skyline, behind the silence of loading docks and the rhythm of sewing machines, Lucchese built something rare. A criminal empire that didn't roar. It hummed. And in that hum, there was power. Unseen, untouched, unshakable. The tailor on East 116th Street never asked who the suits were for. But every few weeks, a man would arrive quietly at closing time, his shoulders squared and his voice low. 3 pieces, wool from Naples, sleeves shortened by half an inch. He paid in cash, always crisp, always clean. And when he left, the tailor would find 2 more clients waiting. Men who barely spoke, except to say, make it like his. They called it the Lucchese cut, tapered, quiet, unmistakable. By the 1950s, Tommy, Lucchese no longer needed to introduce himself. He didn't sit at the heads of long tables. He didn't bark orders in back rooms. He didn't have to. His reach was already stitched into the fabric of New York itself. It started with the airports, LaGuardia and Idlewild, before it became JFK, were gold mines wrapped in asphalt and air traffic. Lucchese never managed terminals. He didn't own planes. What he owned were the hands that moved luggage, loaded crates, inspected cargo, filed paperwork. Through Local 295, Local 810, and the Brotherhood of Teamsters, he controlled who worked, who waited, and who disappeared from the payroll without explanation. A crate of diamonds might vanish before dawn. A rival's shipment might rot on the tarmac for a week. Customs forms were rewritten with a wink. No sirens, no scandals. Just the subtle gravity of power pulling everything toward him. But Lucchese was never content with just ports and packages. His next move was softer, more invisible. The judiciary, he began with court clerks, tired men with wives, mortgages, and aging parents in Queens. Then bailiffs, then local attorneys, then judges. Not all of them crooked, just bendable. He didn't ask for verdicts. He asked for delays, rescheduling, a file that went missing for a week, a case moved to a friendlier jurisdiction. By the mid-1950s, certain courtrooms in Manhattan and the Bronx had unspoken reputations, places where defendants connected to Tommy Shoes didn't sweat. And if you asked how that happened, no one could say, because Lucchese never walked through the courtroom door. He was always outside, or across town, or not even in the city that day. The garment industry, meanwhile, was humming like a well-oiled engine under his control. Seamstresses clocked in without knowing who signed their checks. Union bosses sipped espresso on Mulberry Street, not realizing their decisions had already been made for them. Lucchese didn't bleed the industry dry. He nurtured it, protected deliveries, smoothed out strikes, ensured the fabric kept moving. But a tailor who refused to play ball. His machines broke down. His shipments arrived water-damaged. Or not at all. No violence. Just absence. Just silence. Lucchese's empire didn't announce itself. It whispered. And then there was trucking, the lifeblood of the city. Every crate, every bolt of fabric, every package of cigarettes passed through a vehicle. Lucchese either controlled or influenced. His men didn't steal trucks, they rerouted them. A garment factory that missed a deadline was told the roads were backed up. A rival company that suddenly soared in efficiency likely had one of Lucchese's drivers behind the wheel. He built redundancy into the chaos, supply chains that looked disorganized from the outside, but ran like a watch beneath his touch. It wasn't domination, it was orchestration. One night in 1961, an FBI wiretap recorded a conversation between 2 union officials at LaGuardia. They were arguing about a missing crate of electronics. One said, "Maybe we ask Tommy." The other paused, then whispered, "Tommy already knows." That's when the Bureau realized. Lucchese wasn't just connected to crime. He was the connective tissue. His charm was part of it. Unlike many bosses of the era, Lucchese wasn't prone to rage or insult. He didn't drink excessively, didn't womanize loudly. He rarely lost his temper. He listened. When a labor leader came to him, panicked over a threatened strike, Lucchese placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "It It won't happen. Trust me. The strike never came. No one ever traced the deal. But the union man brought his friends to meet Lucchese the next week. He didn't need to make threats. He made believers. His wardrobe reflected the same philosophy. Tailored, understated, suits that cost thousands but never sparkled, muted greys, deep charcoal. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. He didn't need diamonds or pinky rings. People noticed his silence, and that was louder than anything. Behind the scenes, his influence crept west, into the movie studios of Los Angeles. Not in film production, not in stars or scripts, but in trucking unions, in wardrobe departments, in distribution deals. Jewish mobsters out of Vegas and Miami made introductions. Producers began taking meetings with men who only had one request. We need this guy working crew. They weren't actors, they weren't qualified, but they got the jobs. Because somewhere, at the edge of a film lot, behind a clipboard, was a man whose paycheck belonged to Tommy Lucchese. And as the films rolled out of Hollywood and into East Coast theaters, they arrived on trucks Lucchese controlled. He didn't just touch crime, he touched culture. Politicians weren't immune either. City council members came to him for endorsements. One state senator was gifted a campaign office, rent mysteriously paid by a dry cleaning cooperative with Lucchese ties. A borough president's nephew got a union job. No interview, no questions. No one saw Lucchese's hand. But when the vote passed for increased garment subsidies in 1962, 5 men knew who to thank, and none of them wrote it down. What made Lucchese terrifying wasn't the bodies he buried, because there were few. It was the void he created. A man would look up one day and realize he was working in a system he didn't build, obeying rules he never agreed to, answering to someone he'd never met. And yet, there was order, there was flow, because at the top of it all was a man who never fired a gun, who barely raised his voice, who stitched his empire together like a custom-made suit. One quiet thread at a time. The curtains were drawn tight that morning in Lido Beach. The house, a modest 2-story colonial with beige siding and brick steps, sat at the edge of Reynolds Channel, a quiet body of water that moved more like a memory than a tide. Inside, the air smelled faintly of incense and sterilized linens. The man in the upstairs bedroom had stopped speaking 2 days before. He no longer opened his eyes. His breathing had slowed to a faint rhythm, more echo than breath. The priest whispered final rites beside the bed. His family held hands. Outside, no reporters waited. No sirens. No armored guards. No calls from Washington. Tommy Lucchese was dying, and the world didn't notice. He passed on July 13th, 1967. Officially, of a brain tumor. There was no shootout, no revenge hit, no final arrest, just silence. The newspapers printed a few short paragraphs. Thomas Lucchese, 67, local labor leader, dies in home. The Times didn't mention the airports, or the judges, or the empire that once bent around his fingertips like soft wire. No mugshot, no trial, no blood in the street. He left exactly as he had lived, quietly, intentionally, under the radar. But behind closed doors, the mourning was sharper, not loud, not weeping, just different. In back rooms of Bronx social clubs, men lit cigars with slower hands. In Queens, union leaders passed envelopes to the next man in line and said nothing about where they came from. In Brooklyn, a jeweler who once laundered diamonds through cargo manifests at JFK kept the storefront closed for an extra day. Not because he had to, because something in the city's rhythm had changed. The FBI took note, but barely. By 1967, they were watching Gotti's rise, Bonanno's war, the bloodier, louder men. Lucchese had always been harder to pin down. There were no direct orders, no wires of him making threats, no tapes of him calling hits. He didn't bark, he didn't push, he arranged. And when his name faded from their case files, there was no celebration, only confusion, no trail to follow, no guns to seize, no corpse to point toward a motive. It was as though the wind had shifted and taken the scent of power with it. In life, he'd built an empire that needed no crown. He never declared himself boss, not formally. Yet, by the end, everyone answered to him, in whispers, in nods, in the pauses before decisions were made. He'd supported Carlo Gambino's rise without demanding favors in return. He'd made peace with Jewish racketeers and Irish fixers without pretending to be their friend. He moved among kings and soldiers alike, never raising his voice, never asking to be called Don. He didn't need to be feared. He needed to be obeyed. And he was. His death left no crater, no smoke. But the shape of the mafia, the modern, corporate, low-profile mafia, still carries his fingerprint, gone with the Tommy guns and bloody sidewalks. In their place, quiet takeovers, labor deals, backdoor lobbying. Lucchese taught the mob to be invisible, to wear tailored suits, not bulletproof vests, to shake hands, not fire shots. He turned racketeering into policy, crime into commerce, fear into strategy. Years later, when federal prosecutors studied the roots of modern organized crime, the logistics, the flowcharts, the uncanny ability of crime families to endure, they always found themselves staring at something that bore his design. A system without blood, but not without control. A machine whose gears had been fitted by hands few could remember, but none could replace. At Calvary Cemetery in Queens, his grave marker is simple. No ornate angel. No towering headstone. Just a name. Thomas Lucchese, beloved husband, father, brother. A man who, for 40 years, shaped the underworld with a craftsman's patience and a chess player's foresight. And when he died, he left no final message, no letter, no whispered warning, no memoir. Just a silence that still stretches across New York. In boardrooms, in dockyards, in the pause before a deal is made. The empire he built did not collapse when he left, because it had no walls, only shadows.